Okay, so we're going to start talking about how plants feed. But before we do that, we always have to start evolutionarily with their closest living relatives so that we kind of have a better sense of how evolution proceeded. So we spent the last modules introducing bacterial domains, the bacteria and archaea, and then the early eukaryotes, the protists, of which there are enormous diversity today. Let's do a quick review question, then we'll talk about the group of protists that is today most closely related to the plants, and then we'll cover plants in the next module. Actually, we'll introduce them in this module. So true or false, protists are all single-celled. And the answer here is false. Um, Seaweeds, multicellular. Okay, there are many multicellular protists. In fact, there actually are some multicellular protozoans. There are some multicellular kind of slime molds. Most of them are multicellular. So when it comes to protists, this is actually a world that is both single-celled and experimenting with different ways of being multicellular. Um, so don't forget the seaweeds. They are technically protists in an evolutionary sense, this paraphyletic group of life. Now, here's a group of the clade of plants called land plants. We'll call this kingdom Plantae, the full distinction of everything it means to be a plant. We'll get some synapomorphies later. And then here we have their closest living relatives. These three groups in blue are collectively called the green algae. And then there's another group of algae called the red algae. And these are reddish, the way they do photosynthesis. These are greenish, the way they do photosynthesis. So true or false, according to this phylogeny, the group I've circled here, the green algae, true or false, the green algae are paraphyletic. Think it through. Again, this is a word you don't want to forget. If you need to pause and really look through your notes to figure it out, do so. Okay, the answer here is true. The green algae are paraphyletic. So what are green algae? Basically, all of the descendants of this common ancestor that aren't plants. Okay, so today that's why they call them green algae here, but the formal names actually they're breaking them up into monophyletic groups, which collectively are informally called the green algae, but today are treated as quite different types of protists. Okay, so these are the groups of protists. So we will, when we get to the plants and the animals, we'll talk about groups of protists that are closely related, just so you have a sense of kind of the evolutionary continuity of life. And the plants evolve from something that's like a green alga. Okay, or at least has some of that characteristics. So let's go through the green algae. In general, we know they're paraphyletic, but this is one of the few cases this semester, although you'll see a few more later today, where we're going to use a phrase even though it's not technically accurate anymore, because I don't want to burden you with kind of technical names. This isn't that kind of a class. So paraphyletic group of protists that are all of the green photosynthetic things that are most closely related to plants, but are not plants. The green algae, as you'll quickly see, are insanely diverse, which is another indication that it's not a monophyletic group. Some of these are oceanic marine, some are freshwater, some actually kind of live in kind of boggy water or moist soil, or if it's really rainy, in the barks of trees. There's all kinds of weird green algae. Um, some are single-celled, some are multicellular seaweeds. You're going to see everything under the sun. But when it comes to reproduction, it's basically the same that brown algae did this thing called alternation of generation. So here we have a seaweed. This one's saltwater. Um, and let me show you some more pictures. We'll come back. So these are all different types of seaweeds over here, if they're multicellular. And then we have some single-celled things. This is a single-celled phytoplankton, although it has flagella and moves, but you can tell it's photosynthetic. This is a really goofy genus, Volvox. This looks like a cell with green chloroplasts, but it's not. The little dots are chloroplasts. The big dots are actually cells of green algae that grow this supercell. So this is considered a colonial group of cells. Again, the protists are experimenting with ways to be multicellular. This is a way to be multicellular in a very, very different way. They're not even connected at the cellular level. Very, very weird. Really goofy. And then this one's my favorite, Spirogyra. If you take the biology 1199 lab, you'll often work with this. This is a single cell, and it's multicellular, is like a seaweed. but this is one square cell. And this green part here is a spiral chain of chloroplasts. So this is a group of chloroplasts that basically form a mitotic chain where instead of dividing after mitosis forms a continuous chain of chloroplasts. And then when it gets to a cell wall, you can see the chloroplast chain kind of goes through a little pore and then pops out into the next cell. And so it's a spiral gyrating chloroplast. Really, really cool. If you like this and have some free time, go to YouTube, type in Spirogyra. There's a really awesome funk band from the 1970s, jazz funk band called Spirogyra. I could listen to it all day long, even though it's super corny today. Okay, this is the enormously diverse world of green algae. Now, within the green algae, we go back to the phylogeny, there is one group I do want to focus on, the stoneworts. They are the closest living relatives to the plants that aren't plants on Earth today, as far as we know. This is a group of green algae, and they are freshwater, exclusively only live in freshwater, and they do a weird trick. They produce calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is basically a salt, but it's very hard and it doesn't dissolve super easily, although it does. You know it is the same chemical that makes up snail shells and clam shells. It's pretty strong. It's the same material in limestone, which many houses are built out of. If you ever have concrete, it has a lot of calcium carbonate in it. It's basically a very strong salt. Um, and the stony part and stonewort refers to this kind of special adaptation that this group of algae has, that when the water that they live in starts to evaporate and they're going to die out, their skin cells, basically, they don't really have a true skin, but their cells produce a crust of calcium carbonate, and in the process, they can kind of produce a suit of armor. And then when the water evaporates, they can hibernate in there, a little keep moisture in, and then when it rains again, that calcium carbonate dissolves off and they can go back to living. So it's kind of a survival strategy for environments that are basically on land underwater. And so you can kind of see a transition from oceanic to freshwater, and then we get to the land plants that not surprisingly, live on land. Okay, so this is an environmental kind of evolutionary transition in these groups of life. So these are the stoneworts. This is the habitat of them, not the plants on land, but they're living in these boggy, streamy, kind of pondy environments. This looks like something that's sometimes called duckweed, which is another green algae. Sometimes there's some plants that also live underwater in weird cases, but this is a special one. It's in the genus called Chara. This technically is called the charophytes. You don't need to know the technical names. I'm just showing you what they look like. And basically, it looks like a seaweed. It is a seaweed, but it lives underwater in freshwater. And then when the water evaporates, this white stuff looks like flowers, but it's actually crusts of calcium carbonate crust. As this water evaporates, then the other things that live here will die out. And then when it rains again, the calcium will fall off, and then the seaweeds will survive. So there's like this adaptive ability to deal with dryness that the land plants probably inherited and allowed them to survive on land. Okay, so that's the green algae. Okay, now let's talk about the plants themselves. So the remaining groups until the next exam, which is going to come way closer than you think, is the land plants. This group here is super monophyletic. We'll talk about the synapomorphies later on. We'll give you one for now. They're classified in what's called the kingdom Plantae, meaning the plants. Today we use DNA to figure out phylogenetic relationships, but this is one of the beautiful cases where the morphology and the DNA pretty much tells you the exact same story, at least for all of the major branches. Things that we thought were closely related turn out, yep, they're closely related. Anatomically, structurally, they're very, very similar if they're closely related in terms of how they reproduce, in terms of how they feed, in terms of their overall anatomy. Very, very, very consistent. They are the way we're going to kind of tell the story of the evolution of plants is a story called terrestrialization. And terrestrialization's a complicated idea that puts together all of the things you need to live on land, to be terrestrial. And so the earliest plants you'll see, the earliest lineages of still existing plants that branched off very early, but probably represent kind of what that ancestral way of living was like. They can live on land, but they don't do it very well. They can feed on land, but they don't do it very well. They can reproduce on land. They don't really do that well at all. Okay. And then as each later kind of group of plants evolves, they come up with new innovations, new adaptations that allow them to feed more effectively on land, to survive more effectively on land, to reproduce more effectively on land. Okay. Um, and so we'll put together the whole evolution of the different kinds of plants in the story of terrestrialization. Before we get there, let's talk about the main groups of plants. Actually, before we get there, sorry, let's give the first synapomorphy. So the first of two synapomorphies we'll do for the land plants is that they live on land. This is what the textbook says. They're terrestrial, they're land plants. I will tell you, I hate this synapomorphy because like you and I live on land, and if it's a good synapomorphy, it evolves once in the history of life, and we're not plants. Okay. Frankly, if you were a plant, this exam would be way easier, but you don't think of the world in the way that plants do. Okay. So we'll do this for now, but recognize it's a shoddy, not very good synapomorphies. But land plants, yep, they live on land. We'll get the second one, which is a better one, a real one, when we get to reproduction. Okay. Historically, we've broken the plants into three major groups, and the names have changed a little bit over time because some of them turn out to be paraphyletic. In fact, most of them are, but I want you to know these terms because they're convenient and people still use them today. So the three groups are the non-vascular plants, the seedless plants, or the seedless vascular plants, and the seed plants. Um, you'll notice non-vascular, seedless, we're defining these by what they're not, which should tell your spidey sense that this is paraphyletic. Okay, if you're defined by not what you are, but what you're not, that tells you that you're not that thing, which means you're probably paraphyletic. I like to look at this way. We have two categories. Do you have vascular tissue or not? Remember our structural hierarchy. Organelles, cells, tissue, organs. Okay. The non-vascular plants technically don't have this kind of tissue. They have other kinds of tissue. They have organs, but they don't have vascular tissue. And vascular tissue is basically the circulatory system of a plant. It's specialized cells that are moving sugar water or sap or salt or sorry, sugar water or sap and water through the plant. Okay, these first plants don't have those kinds of cells. They don't have that kind of tissue, so they're non-vascular. The other two groups do have this kind of tissue, so they have vascular cells, they have vascular tissue. They're going to have a much more efficient way of moving sugar through their body to survive, to move water through their body to survive. So that's that part. The second thing is how they reproduce. These first two groups reproduce with spores, which we kind of talked about a little bit, but will make more sense later on. Or they're seedless, they don't produce seeds, and this group, instead of producing spores, produces seeds. So typically the first two are spore bearing, the second is seed bearing. The first one is non-vascular, the next two are vascular. So those combinations mean that we have spore bearing non-vasculars, we have seedless or spore bearing vasculars, and seed and vascular plants. So let's see some pictures of these. And most of these we're not going to go into detail this semester, but you still need to get a sense about how they live. These are examples of what are called the non-vascular plants. Some of these are weird. You've probably never heard of them, liverworts, hornworts, but mosses you've probably heard of. So mosses will be our poster child when you think of non-vascular plants or early plant lineages that branched off early in the history of life. Think of the mosses. You'll notice the word wort is used in these, just like in stonewort. Wort is a German word meaning root, and you'll notice these plants almost look like roots rather than a plant itself. The next group of plants have vascular tissue but still reproduce the old-fashioned way with spores, and most of these you've not heard of, but they're all fern-like in some way. They're much bigger plants because they have bigger circulatory systems, can move fluids longer distances in their body, and our poster child will be ferns. That's the one you've probably heard of. So they invented vascular tissue, these groups here, but they still reproduce with spores. The next groups have vascular tissue, they inherit that, but then they reproduce in a different way with seeds. And then we're going to break them up into two groups. The gymnosperms, which you know as pine trees, which are 5 of these 6 here, including some weird ones called cycads and ginkgos, and then the angiosperms, also called the flowering plants. So we've got flowering plants and cone plants. These are the major clades of the land plants. And here's what their phylogeny looks like.